Imagine a city so fortified, its walls so impenetrable, that it seemed to mock the very idea of conquest. Now imagine an invading army, not with siege engines or battering rams, but with trumpets and a silent march. This is the untold story of Jericho's fall, where an impossible victory was won not by force, but by an unwavering, audacious faith that literally brought mountains or at least massive stone walls to their knees. Welcome to Mindful Musing, a journey with God, where faith comes alive, and every story reminds us that the God of yesterday is still the God of today. Here, we dive deep into the untold wonders of Scripture, immersive, emotional, powerful. Stories that stir your spirit, ignite your faith, and draw you closer to the heart of God. Subscribe now and join the journey, as we step into one of the most astonishing moments in all of biblical history. Chapter 1, Echoes of the Wilderness. The sun beat down on the plains of Moab, scorching the parched earth as it had for 40 long years. For a generation that had known nothing but the vast, unforgiving desert, the promised land was a whisper, a distant hope held onto by the elders who still spoke of Egyptian brick kilns and the thunder of chariots. Now, with the shimmering ribbon of the Jordan River in sight, that whisper had become a roar, vibrating with both thrilling promise and terrifying uncertainty. Their leader, Moses, the man who had parted seas and drawn water from rock, was gone. His towering presence, his direct line to the Almighty, had vanished like a mirage, leaving the mantle of leadership to Joshua, son of Nun. Joshua, a warrior in his own right, had stood by Moses' side through every trial. He'd seen the glory on Mount Sinai and the heartbreak of disobedience in the wilderness. He carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, an immense burden made heavier by the immense task ahead. Before them, rising from the fertile plain, lay Jericho. It wasn't just a city, it was a fortress, a defiant fist of stone and sun-baked brick that seemed to mock the very idea of conquest. Its walls were legendary, not just tall, but thick, designed to withstand any assault. To the Israelites, weary from decades of wandering, Jericho was a monstrous gatekeeper, an insurmountable obstacle guarding the very threshold of their inheritance. Every scout report, every nervous murmur among the ranks, painted a picture of impregnable strength. Joshua knew the stories circulating through the camp, tales of giants in the land, of cities walled to the sky. He had personally witnessed the debilitating fear that had turned a generation back into the wilderness. He understood the deep-seated weariness, the doubt that gnawed at the edges of even the most faithful heart. But he also remembered the voice that had spoken to him directly after Moses' death, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you, I will never leave you nor forsake you." This wasn't a suggestion, it was a divine mandate, a covenant renewed. He walked among his people, his gaze sweeping across the vast encampment. Tents stretched for miles, a sea of brown canvas against the dusty landscape. The air hummed with the low thrum of anticipation, laced with apprehension. Children played, oblivious to the monumental stakes, adults huddled, their faces etched with a mix of longing and fear. Their ancestors had failed to take the land due to their lack of faith. Joshua knew that failure was not an option for his generation. The strategy for Jericho, if one could even call it that, had not yet been revealed. Conventional warfare, he knew, would be suicide. This wasn't just about military might, it was about something far greater, something beyond human understanding. It was about proving, once and for all, that the God who had led them through the desert was capable of delivering them into their promised rest. Jericho stood not just as a physical barrier but as a spiritual challenge, the first true test of their faith in the new era, and the stakes could not have been higher. The very future of Israel, and the fulfillment of ancient promises, hinged on what lay beyond those formidable walls. The desert night in the Israelite camp was a symphony of hushed conversations and the distant bleating of sheep. But inside Joshua's tent, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the flickering oil lamp. He had received his divine directive, a clear command from the Lord that resonated with both absolute certainty and a daunting lack of detail regarding the immediate tactical approach. To breach Jericho, the first, most impenetrable gate to the promised land, he needed intelligence. Not just military intelligence, but a deeper understanding of the city's heart, its pulse, its vulnerabilities beyond the obvious. He chose 2 men, their names not recorded in the sacred texts, perhaps intentionally, to highlight the anonymity of courage. These were not seasoned generals, but faithful, shrewd individuals, tasked with the most perilous of missions, to infiltrate Jericho. Their objective: to observe, to assess the morale within the walls, and to gauge the city's readiness for war. They slipped away under the cloak of darkness, carrying the hopes and fears of an entire nation. Jericho, even at night, pulsed with a tense energy. Its massive double walls, often 20 feet thick at their base, loomed against the starlit sky. The inner wall, built upon a high mound, provided a second, equally formidable defense. Watchmen were posted, their silhouettes stark against the moonlight, their vigilance palpable. The spies, masters of stealth, navigated the labyrinthine streets, a stark contrast to the open plains they had known for so long. Every shadow held a potential threat, every sudden noise a heart-stopping moment. Their mission, however, took an unexpected turn when they sought refuge. Not with a fellow traveler, nor a discreet merchant, but in the house of a harlot named Rahab. Her dwelling, built into the city wall itself, offered a unique vantage point and, crucially, a degree of anonymity that a more respectable establishment might not. Rahab was a woman on the fringes of society, accustomed to transactions and secrets, her life a constant negotiation of survival. Yet, within her, something deeper stirred. Word of the Israelites' miraculous crossing of the Jordan had reached Jericho, stirring a potent mixture of dread and disbelief. The inhabitants whispered of a fearsome, unseen God who commanded rivers to part and nations to tremble. Rahab, more attuned to the currents of fear and power than most, had listened. She had witnessed the growing panic in the eyes of the city elders and felt the tremors of uncertainty ripple through the marketplace. She had made a choice, a desperate gamble based not on military strength but on a profound, terrifying intuition. When the Jericho authorities, alerted to the presence of spies, came knocking, Rahab did the unthinkable. She lied, protecting the men, hiding them among the stalks of flax drying on her rooftop. Her words, recorded for posterity, laid bare her conviction: "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you." Her act was not mere self-preservation, it was a profound declaration of faith, a recognition of a higher power than the one her city worshipped. In return for her life and the lives of her family, the spies made an oath. A scarlet cord tied in her window would be the sign, a beacon of salvation in the coming cataclysm. It was a covenant of blood and mercy, woven into the very fabric of the city's impending doom. As the spies descended from her window, slipping back into the night, they carried not just intelligence, but a testament to an unexpected alliance, a glimmer of hope born from the most unlikely of places within the very heart of the enemy. The stage was set, the divine plan unfolding in ways no one could have predicted. The intelligence brought back by the spies, particularly Rahab's confession of Jericho's terror, was a vital piece of the puzzle, yet it did not diminish the sheer physical impossibility that still lay before them, the Jordan River. It was late spring, the time of the barley harvest, and the Jordan was not the gentle stream seen in drier seasons. Swollen by melting snows from Mount Hermon, it was at its banks' fullest, a formidable, raging torrent, impassable for an army numbering hundreds of thousands, complete with women, children, livestock, and all their possessions. Conventional wisdom, and indeed, any military textbook, would have dictated weeks, if not months, to construct sufficient bridges or rafts. But conventional wisdom was not part of God's plan. Joshua, now armed with the spy's report and fortified by divine reassurance, issued the command. Unlike the desperate flight from Egypt, this crossing was to be a deliberate, orchestrated act of faith. 3 days prior, officers had moved through the camps, relaying Joshua's instructions: "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set out from your place and follow it." The ark, the tangible representation of God's presence, would lead the way, not the earthly commander. This emphasized not Israel's might, but Yahweh's ultimate authority. The morning arrived, cool and crisp, but pregnant with anticipation. The vast encampment stirred before dawn, a silent, disciplined movement as families packed the last of their belongings. The air hummed with nervous excitement. Then, a profound silence fell as the priests, robed and solemn, lifted the Ark of the Covenant, its gold gleaming in the nascent light. Behind them, the Levites carried the sacred vessels. An estimated 2,000 cubits, roughly half a mile, separated the Ark from the main body of the people, a visual testament to the sacred space around God's presence, and a clear signal for all to witness the miracle that was about to unfold. As the feet of the priests, bearing the Ark, touched the very edge of the roaring, swollen river, an instantaneous, impossible phenomenon occurred. Upstream, far to the north at a town called Adam, near Zarethan, the waters piled up in a heap, a solid wall of water standing still. Downstream, the waters flowing towards the Dead Sea were completely cut off, draining away. The riverbed, moments before a swirling, muddy torrent, was now dry, exposed earth. A collective gasp swept through the Israelite multitude. The sight was not just astounding, it was deeply unsettling, a visceral demonstration of God's absolute control over creation. It wasn't merely a parting of waters like the Red Sea, this was a complete cessation, a piling up of a moving river. It was an undeniable sign, both for Israel and for the terrified inhabitants of Canaan, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was actively fighting for his people. For an entire day, hundreds of thousands of Israelites, their animals, and their possessions traversed the dry riverbed. It was an orderly, deliberate crossing, not a frantic escape. In the middle of the riverbed, Joshua commanded 12 stones to be set up, a perpetual memorial for future generations, a physical reminder of God's faithfulness and power. The crossing was complete. On the other side, on the plains of Jericho, the full reality of their inheritance, and the battles yet to come, settled upon them. But first, there was a profound encounter, a moment of divine alignment for Joshua himself, before the true siege began. The elation of crossing the Jordan on dry ground still hummed through the Israelite camp at Gilgal. They had established their base of operations on the plains, a temporary city of tents where the ritual of circumcision was performed, marking a new generation's commitment to the covenant, and where they celebrated Passover on Canaanite soil, finally eating the produce of the land after decades of manna. Yet, the question of Jericho, the formidable obstacle that loomed just a few miles to the west, persisted like a silent, unyielding challenge. Joshua, a seasoned commander schooled in skirmishes and strategic wilderness movements, now faced a dilemma that defied every known military principle. Jericho's defenses were legendary. Ancient cities were typically conquered through protracted sieges, aiming to starve the inhabitants, or through direct assaults using siege towers, battering rams, and scaling ladders. Such operations required immense resources, time, and, invariably, heavy casualties. Against Jericho's thick, double walls, its lower retaining wall alone standing over a dozen feet high, topped by a formidable mud brick wall, any conventional attack seemed like a futile gesture. The citizens of Jericho, with a reliable spring within their walls and a recent harvest safely stored, were well prepared for a long siege. It was during this period of contemplation, likely while surveying the imposing silhouette of Jericho, that Joshua had an encounter that transcended the physical realm. He lifted his eyes and saw a figure standing before him, not an Israelite, not a Canaanite, but a man with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua, ever the soldier, immediately challenged him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The figure's response, however, cut through the simplistic divisions of earthly conflict, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." This was no ordinary angel. The air around the figure crackled with divine authority. Recognizing the presence of the Holy, Joshua immediately fell on his face to the ground in worship, a gesture reserved only for God himself. This was the pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord, come to assume command of the impending battle. The instruction that followed echoed a sacred moment from generations past: "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." It was a solemn reminder that this was God's war, and Joshua was merely his servant, albeit an indispensable one. The battle plan revealed by this divine commander was utterly unprecedented, a blueprint that would have been dismissed as madness by any earthly general. There were no siege engines to be built, no flanking maneuvers, and no scaling parties. Instead, the strategy was one of profound, unwavering obedience, a ritualistic act of faith designed to demonstrate God's power rather than human might. For 6 days, the entire armed force of Israel, preceded by 7 priests blowing ram's horn trumpets and carrying the Ark of the Covenant, was to march once around the city walls in complete silence. No shouts, no war cries, just the measured tread of feet and the mournful, piercing sound of the shofars. On the 7th day, this ritual would escalate, 7 circuits, followed by a great shout from the people, and then, the promise, the wall of the city will fall down flat. The audacious simplicity of it was both a test and a revelation. It demanded absolute trust. Imagine the whispers that must have begun, the doubts that surely flickered through the minds of some soldiers, the sheer intellectual challenge of reconciling such a bizarre tactic with the impenetrable walls before them. Yet, Joshua, having stood on holy ground, understood. This wasn't a human siege. It was a divine intervention, a visible demonstration that the true battle was not fought with swords and spears, but with faith. The very absurdity of the plan was its genius, forcing Israel to rely entirely on the power of their God. The stage was now set for the most unconventional, yet epic, siege in history. The first morning dawned, crisp and cool on the plains of Jericho. The sun, a disk of fire climbing above the eastern mountains, illuminated the formidable walls of the city, now closer, more menacing. The air in the Israelite camp crackled with a nervous energy, a blend of apprehension and the profound sense of destiny that had characterized their journey thus far. Joshua had given the command, relaying the extraordinary, almost bizarre, instructions received from the divine commander. Now, it was time for action. The procession began. At the forefront, chosen for their sacred duty, were the armed men, not in a skirmishing line, but as an honor guard. Behind them came the priests, 7 of them, each holding a shofar, a ram's horn trumpet, ancient and unadorned. Their faces were set, their breath controlled, knowing that their role was pivotal. Following them, borne on poles by Levites, was the Ark of the Covenant, veiled from direct sight, but its presence was a palpable weight of divine authority. And behind the Ark, the vast multitude of Israel, a silent river of humanity, stretching back to the horizon. The first circuit was a study in profound discipline. The only sounds were the rhythmic blowing of the trumpets, not a triumphant fanfare, but a low, mournful, almost hypnotic wail, and the measured shuffle of hundreds of thousands of feet on the dusty ground. No shouts of war, no taunts, no battle cries. Just silence from the masses, a testament to their unwavering obedience. They walked around the entire circumference of the city, Jericho's sentries watching from the battlements, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing unease. From inside Jericho, the sight was utterly baffling. The citizens, crowded onto their formidable walls, had prepared for a conventional siege. They expected battering rams, archers, a direct assault. Instead, they witnessed this silent, daily parade. On day 1, perhaps, there was mockery, shouts of derision from the safety of their stone defenses. What kind of army was this that merely walked around their city? Their gods, their formidable defenses, surely would protect them from such foolishness. But as the days wore on, the mocking likely faded. Day after day, the procession repeated. The same measured steps, the same haunting trumpet blasts, the same unnerving silence from the vast army. The ritual became monotonous, yet its very monotony deepened the psychological pressure. Sleep patterns within Jericho were surely disrupted. Every morning, the same sight. Every afternoon, the same departure. The Israelites did not camp outside the walls, they returned to Gilgal, only to reappear the next day. This created an unsettling rhythm, eroding the confidence of the besieged. What were they doing? What was the meaning of this silent, relentless vigil? The inhabitants of Jericho, accustomed to clear threats, were facing an enigma. Fear, a corrosive agent, began to seep into the cracks of their collective resolve. The whispers of the Israelites' God, the one who had parted the Jordan, would have grown louder in the minds of the people within the walls. Was this silent circling a magical incantation? A prelude to something truly terrifying? For the Israelites, too, it was a profound test. 6 days of marching in silence, exposed to the elements, their faith constantly challenged by the visible reality of the impenetrable walls. It demanded immense self-control, a surrender of their natural instincts for aggression and action. Joshua, steadfast and unwavering, would have reinforced the divine promise, reminding them that this was God's battle, to be fought on God's terms. As the sun set on the 6th day, the stage was set. The silent vigil had done its work, not on the physical walls, but on the spirit of two peoples, one, growing increasingly terrified, the other, poised on the brink of an unprecedented act of faith. The dawn of the 7th day broke over the plains of Jericho, not with the usual rhythm of the past 6, but with an electric tension that vibrated through every tent, every soul in the Israelite camp. It was a silent hum of anticipation, a premonition of the colossal event about to unfold. The previous 6 days had been a relentless exercise in discipline and faith, the methodical daily march, the mournful blare of the trumpets, the absolute, eerie silence of the vast multitude. This sustained, unconventional, siege had stretched the limits of human patience and belief, preparing both the besiegers and the besieged for the unimaginable. Joshua, having spent the night in prayer and communion with the divine commander, felt the weight of the moment acutely. The promise was clear, yet the mechanism remained a mystery: the wall of the city will fall down flat. How? By whose power? His leadership now demanded not just unwavering faith, but an ability to transmit that unshakable conviction to every last soldier, every fearful family. He had to ensure that when the critical moment came, their obedience would be absolute, their collective voice a singular roar of faith. Inside Jericho's formidable walls, the atmosphere was a cauldron of dread. The silent, daily ritual of the Israelites had done its work. The initial derision had long evaporated, replaced by a deep, corrosive fear. The continuous, unexplained circling had become a psychological torment. Each morning, as the distant, haunting shofars began their wail, a fresh wave of panic would sweep through the city. Rumors, wild and terrifying, surely circulated, tales of a vengeful God who commanded rivers and now walked around cities, silently observing, waiting. The city's formidable defenses, once a source of impregnable confidence, now felt like a trap. What good were thick walls if the enemy didn't try to climb them? What defense was there against a foe whose tactics defied logic, whose power seemed supernatural? The granaries were full, the springs still flowed, but the spirit of the people was slowly draining away, replaced by an agonizing wait for the unknown. Sleep would have been fleeting, filled with nightmares of marching armies and the unsettling sound of unseen trumpets. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every creak of the ancient timbers a prelude to disaster. Joshua's commanders and the heads of the tribes would have felt the immense pressure too. They had witnessed God's power at the Jordan, but this was different. This was a sustained, inexplicable act. Maintaining the morale of such a vast army, preventing dissent or questions, required constant reassurance, a reiteration of the divine promise, and an unshakable faith in Joshua's leadership. The faith of an entire nation was being tested, not by battle, but by waiting, by performing a ritual that seemed to have no earthly purpose. As the morning mist began to lift, revealing the silhouette of Jericho, the command was given, not 1 circuit this time, but 7. The intensity would be multiplied. The trumpets would blare, louder and more insistent. And then, the shattering, collective shout that would be the catalyst for the miraculous. The Israelites stood poised, their hearts pounding not just with fear, but with a profound, almost unbearable anticipation. They were on the precipice of history, about to witness a demonstration of divine power that would forever etch their God's name into the annals of the world, and reshape the map of Canaan. The air on the plains outside Jericho, usually thick with dust and the mundane sounds of a vast encampment, was on this seventh morning charged with an almost unbearable static. The 6 days of silent, ritualistic marching had created an incredible vacuum of anticipation, a silence so profound that the expected noise of a traditional siege was almost unimaginable. Joshua had given his final instructions, terse and absolute: 7 circuits this day, then the trumpets would blare, and then, and only then, the people were to shout. Not a whisper, not a murmur, until that moment. The procession began as before, but with a heightened intensity. The 7 priests, bearing their ram's horns, seemed to walk with a more urgent step. The Ark of the Covenant, God's very presence, was carried with solemn purpose. And the armed men, followed by the silent, vast multitude, moved with a unity born of unwavering faith and immense, pent-up energy. They completed the first circuit, then the second, then the third, each revolution building the tension, tightening the invisible springs of divine power. From the ramparts of Jericho, the scene was one of bewildering, soul-numbing repetition. The daily march, once a source of mockery, had transformed into a relentless psychological assault. The city's inhabitants, gathered on their walls, huddled in their houses, could feel the pressure building. Each passing circuit was a tick of a doomsday clock they couldn't comprehend. The haunting, monotonous drone of the shofars, amplified by the silent air, was a sound that would forever be etched into their collective terror. Their confidence, once so impregnable, had eroded with each passing day, each silent footfall. They were facing an enemy whose power was unseen, whose methods defied reason. As the 7th circuit began, a new tremor, subtle at first, ran through the ground beneath the Israelites' feet. The trumpet blasts, too, seemed to grow in intensity, a long, continuous note, piercing the oppressive silence. The marching grew more determined. The sun was high now, beating down on the dust-choked plain, but no one faltered. Every eye was fixed on Jericho's walls, every heart pounded with a mixture of terror and exhilarating faith. Then, the command came. Joshua's voice, perhaps not audible to all but relayed instantaneously through the ranks, cut through the trumpet blast: "Shout! For the Lord has given you the city." And the shout came. It was not a fragmented cry, nor a disorganized roar. It was a single, earth-shattering wave of sound, hundreds of thousands of voices erupting in unison, a collective release of 6 days of pent-up silence, faith, and anticipation. It was a roar of obedience, a declaration of trust in their God. At that exact, instantaneous moment, the impossible occurred. The massive walls of Jericho did not crumble slowly, nor did they crack under battering rams. They fell down, flat, literally, they collapsed inward upon themselves. The ground beneath the city buckled, the massive stones and sun-baked bricks disintegrating as if made of sand. The sound would have been deafening. A cataclysmic roar of collapsing masonry, a cloud of choking dust, and the screams of those trapped within the falling stronghold. The fortified city, impregnable for centuries, lay exposed, its defenses reduced to rubble by a shout and a trumpet blast, a testament not to human might, but to divine power. The path to the promised land was now open. The dust, thick and suffocating, billowed for long moments over the ruins of Jericho. Where impenetrable walls had stood moments before, there was now a chaotic expanse of rubble, revealing the terrified, exposed inhabitants within. The silence that had preceded the collapse was violently replaced by the shouts of the Israelite army and the desperate cries from the doomed city. The Lord's command was clear: Jericho, the firstfruits of the conquest, was to be entirely devoted to him. This meant the complete destruction of all its inhabitants and possessions, save for the precious metals, which were to be consecrated to the Lord's treasury. It was a stark, uncompromising act of divine justice against a city deeply entrenched in idolatry and depravity, a cleansing before the promised land could be truly occupied. The Israelite army surged forward, not over, but into the fallen city. The chaos of the moment would have been absolute. Soldiers, once constrained by the silent march, now moved with a terrible efficiency, driven by the understanding of their divine mandate. The screams of the dying mingled with the crackle of burning timbers as houses caught fire. It was a brutal, uncompromising fulfillment of prophecy, a chilling demonstration of the consequences of sustained rebellion against God's ultimate authority. Amidst this terrifying judgment, a solitary beacon of mercy shone through the devastation. Joshua, remembering the covenant made by his spies, issued a specific, urgent command: "Go into the harlot's house and bring out the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." The two spies, risking their own lives once more, navigated the treacherous rubble, identifying Rahab's house by the vivid scarlet cord hanging conspicuously from her wind. The dust, thick and suffocating, billowed for long moments over the ruins of Jericho. Where impenetrable walls had stood moments before, there was now a chaotic expanse of rubble, revealing the terrified, exposed inhabitants within. The silence that had preceded the collapse was violently replaced by the shouts of the Israelite army and the desperate cries from the doomed city. The Lord's command was clear: Jericho, the firstfruits of the conquest, was to be entirely devoted to him. This meant the complete destruction of all its inhabitants and possessions, save for the precious metals, which were to be consecrated to the Lord's treasury. It was a stark, uncompromising act of divine justice against a city deeply entrenched in idolatry and depravity, a cleansing before the promised land could be truly occupied. The Israelite army surged forward, not over, but into the fallen city. The chaos of the moment would have been absolute. Soldiers, once constrained by the silent march, now moved with a terrible efficiency, driven by the understanding of their divine mandate. The screams of the dying mingled with the Krakow, a simple yet profoundly powerful symbol of faith amidst the surrounding chaos. They found Rahab and her entire household huddled together, her father, mother, brothers, and sisters, all trembling but safe under the sign of the scarlet thread. They were led out of the crumbling city, brought to a place of safety outside the Israelite camp, effectively quarantined from the devotion of Jericho. While the rest of the city and all its contents were consumed by fire, Rahab's house and family were spared. This act of selective mercy was not an oversight, it was a deliberate demonstration of God's character. Rahab, an outcast in her own society, a woman whose profession might have condemned her in any other circumstance, was saved not by her inherent goodness, but by her audacious faith. She had recognized the power of the true God and acted upon that conviction, even at immense personal risk. Her salvation underscored a profound theological truth, that even in the midst of overwhelming judgment, God's grace extends to those who turn to Him. She, a Gentile, would later be grafted into the lineage of Israel, ultimately becoming an ancestor of King David, and much later, of Jesus Christ himself. Her story, woven into the fabric of Jericho's destruction, served as a timeless testament to divine grace and the transformative power of belief, offering a glimmer of redemption amidst the ashes. With Jericho utterly destroyed, its formidable walls reduced to dust, and its inhabitants judged, a profound stillness settled over the plains. Smoke still curled from the ruins, a stark monument to the power that had been unleashed. For the Israelites, the experience was deeply transformative. They had witnessed, firsthand, the literal fulfillment of God's promise through a means that defied all human logic and military strategy. This wasn't a victory achieved by their superior numbers or martial prowess, but by their absolute obedience and their God's omnipotence. Joshua, now more than ever confirmed as God's chosen leader, issued a solemn proclamation over the charred remains of the city. He laid a curse upon anyone who dared to rebuild Jericho. "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and builds this city, Jericho, at the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." This was not merely an angry decree, but a prophetic warning, safeguarding the sanctity of this site where God had so powerfully intervened. It emphasized that Jericho was not just another conquered city, it was a memorial to God's unique judgment and faithfulness. This curse, recorded in Scripture, would indeed come to pass centuries later, a chilling testament to the enduring power of God's word. The immediate lessons for Israel were manifold and critical for their continuing conquest of Canaan. First, the absolute necessity of obedience. The silent marches, the seemingly absurd instructions, these were not arbitrary tests, but foundational acts of worship and submission. Second, the undeniable power of God. Jericho proved that no obstacle was too great for their Lord. Walls that stood against armies crumbled at a divinely orchestrated shout. Third, the fulfillment of his promises. The land, so long promised, was now demonstrably theirs, its first formidable gate breached by divine intervention. The fall of Jericho sent shockwaves throughout Canaan. The news of a river parting and an unbreachable city collapsing without a single conventional blow spread like wildfire. The fear that Rahab had described was amplified across the land, demoralizing the remaining city-states and paving the way, psychologically, for future conquests. The God of Israel was not just a tribal deity, he was the God who commanded creation itself. Jericho became the indelible symbol of this truth, a benchmark against which all future challenges would be measured. It solidified Israel's identity not merely as a nomadic people, but as the chosen nation through whom God would display his glory and fulfill his redemptive plan. The path to the promised land had been opened, but the lessons learned at Jericho, of absolute reliance on God and the devastating consequences of his judgment, would guide them through the battles yet to come. The story of Jericho's fall, etched into the very bedrock of biblical history, transcends a mere ancient battle narrative. It stands as a timeless and profound testament to the nature of divine power, the imperative of radical faith, and the complex interplay of justice and mercy in God's dealings with humanity. For a mature audience, it invites deeper contemplation on themes that resonate far beyond the plains of Canaan. We see the nature of divine justice in its rawest form. Jericho, a city steeped in practices abhorrent to God, received the full measure of his judgment. This prompts us to grapple with the uncomfortable truths of ancient warfare and the often challenging commands of a holy God, pushing us to consider his ultimate sovereignty and the consequences of widespread societal corruption. Yet, interwoven with this judgment is the striking light of divine mercy, embodied in Rahab. Her story reminds us that God's grace can reach into the unlikeliest of places, offering redemption to those who, by faith, turn towards him, regardless of their past. The narrative also powerfully illustrates the intersection of free will and divine plan. The Israelites chose to obey, and Rahab chose to believe, yet God's overarching purpose for the land of Canaan was sovereignly fulfilled. This challenges us to consider our own role in God's grand narrative. Are we willing to trust and obey, even when the path seems illogical or insurmountable? In our modern world, we may not face literal walls of stone, but we encounter walls of our own, insurmountable challenges in our personal lives, formidable obstacles in our communities, or overwhelming global crises. The story of Jericho offers a powerful metaphor. It teaches us that perhaps the key to overcoming these barriers isn't always brute force or conventional wisdom, but an unconventional, audacious faith that aligns with a higher power. It reminds us that sometimes, the greatest victories are achieved not by our strength, but by our surrender to a plan far greater than our own. What walls stand before you today that seem impossible to overcome? Reflect on the unwavering obedience of Joshua and the audacious faith of Rahab. What seemingly illogical step of faith might God be asking you to take? Consider how the story of Jericho challenges your understanding of divine justice and mercy. How might this ancient narrative deepen your trust in a God who operates beyond our human comprehension, capable of bringing down the most formidable barriers in our lives?